and I'm going to introduce the speaker of the morning, the Reverend Mr. W.O.H. Garman, probably known to all of you, certainly known to vast multitudes of people in our country for his great good works. He's president of the Associated Gospel Churches. This is not a denomination, it is a service agency serving some millions of Christian people in a great many denominations. He is president also of the American Association of Schools of Higher Learning. This is schools at the college level and seminaries. Christian schools and seminaries. They're getting hard to find, but there are a good many of them that this good man and his agency serves. He is also a deputy sheriff. Now that's a little bit unusual association, but it's a good one. And we ought to have more Christian people serving us in official positions. Mr. Garman goes on tours of inspection in various parts of the country on behalf of the Defense Department. Even Washington, you know, when they really want something done by somebody in whom they have confidence, turn to a Christian gentleman to get it done. And it's my privilege and my honor to have the pleasure of introducing to you this morning the Reverend Mr. W.O.H. Garman, who will now speak to you on the subject. It's in your program, but I believe it's written here as the Minister of Law, Order, and Freedom. Mr. Garman.
We certainly appreciate being introduced by such an illustrious person as Dr. Kershner, whose many articles I've read for many years and greatly appreciated. We certainly need more men like him in his particular field, and I'm so happy for the reception that his good book is receiving. I'm glad he cut out most of the introduction that could have been made. I think sometimes it's overdone. They asked me to submit a biography, and it's 3.5 pages. You can find a digest of it and who's who. When it's overdone, I sometimes feel like the widow whose husband had died and had been a bum, a drunken bum. And like many people in occasions like that, she didn't have a church membership, but she thought that her husband should have a Christian funeral. So she engaged the services of a local minister. He came in, he consented to preach. And he extolled the virtues of this departed brother very highly. What a wonderful father, provider he was, how kind, how gracious, what a good citizen. So finally this poor woman said to her son, "Johnny, go over and see if that's your old man in that casket." This morning we're going to attempt to very briefly discuss two matters. One has to do with one of these tours of investigation which has taken me around the world. Mrs. McKinney, when she discovered that I'm just back on late Monday evening from a tour of our bases in the Mediterranean. We have one, of course, in Bermuda, as you know. That's a NAS base, Naval Air Station. We have quite a few in Puerto Rico, Ramey Air Force Base on the west coast. We have several forts in the northern section of the island. We have one at Ponce in the southern part of the island. Then we have Roosevelt Roads, which is on the far eastern side of the island. That is a testing ground for the military, for the Navy. They have thousands of square miles of controlled ocean there where they test their guns, and right now it's particularly missiles. in any future war, there won't be too much reliance upon 12 and 16-inch cannon, which only exist now on a few battleships that are in mothballs. Most of the fighting will be by missiles, and also not only missiles based on ships, and we have ships which are entire missile ships now, but missiles fired from planes which can be directed by radar, and missiles, of course, fired from silos here in the States and in other countries where we had them. In Panama, we have quite a few bases, perhaps 15. We were interested in one in particular, which is at Albrook, and then in addition to that, there's a great naval station right near Fort Amador, and we were there and visited all these bases. Then we flew back up to Homestead, which is in Florida, and went over matters there. Mrs. McKinney thought you'd like to know something about the situation as we just learned it. Dr. McBurney the other evening gave you quite an excellent breakdown on our missile problem, and it is a problem. Perhaps the Russians at this moment have in certain fields superiority. Whether they're going to maintain it or not, I don't know. He mentioned secret weapons, and I'm happy to be able to tell you there are far more secret weapons than he described to you. In October, it'll be my happy privilege again to go to Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland to witness and to photograph the very latest weapons that have had their wraps taken off that we can describe in public. Some we can. Some of it's not only top security, but it's top secret. But what can be described will be divulged, and in some of the future meetings that we'll hold, I'll be able to bring you more up to date on our military stance as it actually exists. You may be interested to know that just a few days ago I examined the blueprints and drawings of a new weapon that we'll be using. It's a Gatling gun type machine gun, except it'll be firing actually cannon missiles, 20 mm, which is a sizable round to be fired from a machine gun. Some time ago, I photographed one of our Gatling guns in operation, which was firing 7,000 rounds of 20 millimeter ammunition a minute. They were using tracer ammunition, and I was directly behind the gun, and from where I was standing down to targets that they were hitting 200, 300 yards away, looked like a solid line of hot metal. Now, a tracer you can see as it goes through the sky. This new gun will fire 10,000 rounds a minute. Now, we have many other things that I won't take time now to describe. I'm not going to make any prognostications concerning any future war or engagement. I deplore, as much as our former speaker did this morning, the fact that we're involved in a no-win war. On these journeys, these junkets, these tours of investigation, I also get to preach. I not only deal with matters that are strictly military, but I go into the various chapels, Army, Air Force, Marine, Navy, whatever it happens to be, and preach. And in preaching at Albrook, we had a fine congregation. I didn't hesitate to tell them that the group that I represented, for instance, was conservative politically and conservative in religion. We believe in the Trinity. We believe in the deity of Christ, his virgin birth, his substitutionary blood atonement on the cross, his literal resurrection, his literal second coming. We believe in the inspiration of the Bible. We believe in salvation by grace through faith plus nothing else. We believe in a literal heaven and a literal hell, and we believe in law and order. We believe in fighting wars to win wars. And I tell these groups this wherever I go. And I'm happy to do it, because we have a lot of traitors in our midst today who come representing the National Council of Churches and certain academic bodies that no longer believe any of those things. They don't even believe in righteousness and decency. Of course, they don't believe in law and order. And I told the group in this one chapel service concerning some of these men who are preachers, priests, and rabbis who go out in these demonstrations and encourage the demonstrators to throw bombs and fire shots and throw bricks and rape and to carry on. I said they should be taken out and shot because they're traitors. They're traitors to God, to their Christ, to the Bible, to law and order, to their nation. They're just no good. They shouldn't be in a pulpit by any means. In addition, we had a lot of other things to tell them concerning the situation as it exists in the country. They're happy to know that there are groups that support them. The most maligned people in the world today are, of course, conservatives. You were just maligned in the morning paper. And not only conservatives politically, John Birch Society, but conservatives in pulpits. I never expect to get a good word from the press or from TV. We had a very fine Memorial Day service. One of our biggest stations showed up. And they claimed they were going to put the whole thing on TV. They didn't put any on TV because I talked in that meeting, just like I am talking here this morning, and I was in my uniform. I'm chaplain in our sheriff's department. I'm a deputy sheriff. I have a captain's rating, and I've been told I'm to be promoted to major. And I believe in taking a real active part. It's understood that if a riot takes place, off comes the cross from my collar, and I go out with the men on the street with a gun. And that's the only way we're going to maintain law and order. Now, the primary purpose of my presence here is to speak about law and order. Mrs. McKinney wanted me to tell you something about this tour. I can't tell you too much about the morale of the men. The men that I met were quite satisfied, but they're principally officers. We did, on 2 occasions, eat in the non-commissioned officers' mess. We almost invariably eat, of course, in the officers' mess. We're assigned to officers' quarters. They've been very good to me. They have appreciated my efforts. Usually I travel with the honorary status of a colonel, but just recently they told me in one base, we're giving you the same reception that we give a major general, and I appreciated that. Now, in dealing with the subject that I'm going to pursue and what follows, I have a story to tell you. One of my friends with whom I've toured various bases is Major General Roy M. Terry. And he has a story he likes to tell. I've heard it quite a few times. Of course, I never take exception. He's like other preachers. He repeats his messages quite frequently. I almost know some of them by heart. But very frequently he'll begin his discourse with something like this. I have something good to tell you and I have something bad to tell you. And then he tells a story about an Italian company in North Africa. They were being hotly pursued by the British, who gave them no respite. They had hardly time to eat. For weeks they hadn't had time to wash, take a bath, or anything else, and they smelt to high heaven. So the company commander one morning lined them up. He says, I have something good for you, and I have some bad news for you. Now, he said, for the good news, we're going to change our underwear today. He said, Giuseppe, you're going to change underwear with Tony. And Giovanni, you're going to change underwear with Mark. So that was the bad news, that part, see. They changed underwear, but they weren't benefited a bit. Some things I'll have to say are depressing. I'm not, however, a pessimist to the extent that I believe in giving way to fear. I'm not afraid at all. I'm not afraid of Russia, nor China, nor all of those nations put together. If we're on the side of the Lord, we don't have to fear. I do fear for America. If we don't change our conduct, if we don't get back to God and and restore our faith in Christ and Christian morality in this book here, we're going to be in deep trouble. The history of the Bible, and also secular history, bears out the fact that wars are the result of sin. And as long as you have sin in the world, you're going to have wars. And our conflict with criminals is with sinners, and likewise with criminal nations that sin. When you read your Bible carefully, you'll discover that God used wars often, very frequently, to punish the people of Israel. This may surprise you, but in the book of Isaiah, chapter 45, Cyrus, a Persian king, a world conqueror, was called the shepherd of God, the anointed of God. The last verse of 44 calls him a shepherd. The first verse of 45 calls him the anointed. Christos in the Greek, in your New Testament translation, means anointed. In addition to that, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, who conquered the Jews and carried them away into captivity, is repeatedly referred to as my servant by God Almighty in His inspired word. You may also be interested to know that the Lord referred to the Assyrian as a rod of my indignation. And that indignation could be poured out upon America, I think, today, very readily, if it were not for the grace and mercy of Almighty God. We're in a desperate situation. Now, I'll give you some facts and figures. It's not all bad. There's a good side to the report, and I think I have something practical to leave with you concerning a possibility in which you can become engaged in helping to restore law and order to this country. First of all, being a preacher, I'd like to use a text. If it hadn't been for the magnificent message that Dr. Bob brought yesterday, I was going to completely change this message, because this group here needed some more Bible instruction, far more than I have heard, in order to set you straight concerning coming events and just what's out there in the future. Today, in dealing with the subject of law and order, I want to begin with a verse in Genesis 9, verse 6. This is the first time in the biblical record that the magisterial duties, functions, responsibilities of mankind are mentioned. Now, I said magisterial. This is the beginning of human government. Human government was ordained of God. We read in verse 6, whosoever sheddeth man's blood. Can you quote the rest of it? Whosoever sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And here's why. For in the image of God made he man. Now, over in the New Testament, you have similar teaching. This time, I'm going to take you to the 13th chapter of the book of Romans. Dr. Bob quoted the first part of the passage. It's verses 1 to 6, or 1 to 7, I'm sorry. I'm going to begin with verse 3, since he has already quoted the first two verses. It reads here, for rulers are not a terror to good works, but to evil. They should be. That's not quite true of the Supreme Court right now, which in my book fails to be supreme in any respect. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power, and your word power here could be translated government. Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he, that is the ruler, is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. Here's your same magisterial duty and responsibility of government. Now, back in Old Testament times, there was the Avenger of Blood. They didn't have highway patrolmen. They didn't have a local police force. They didn't even have a standing army. And murders were punished usually by the next of kin of the person who had been slain. And your magistrate today, your ruler, your policeman, the man in the military, all of which are being very much malign is the Avenger of God. We also read here, for he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore you must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye, and it says tribute, and the word in Greek's taxes. Proper taxes are to be paid. We have no objection. For they are the ministers of God, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, and it should read now instead of tribute, taxes, to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, and then we have the word honor in the English, and more correctly it could be translated respect. There should be proper respect for men in authority. Now sometimes it's a little difficult to show this respect. Some years ago, President Truman sent me a very beautiful portrait of himself. It's a magnificent piece of work. It's that big, beautifully framed, written across to the bottom in his handwriting, with kindest regards to Reverend W.H. Garman. I appreciated that, but you know, when he fired General MacArthur for winning the war, I was so disgusted. I took the thing down, and it hung up in my study. It's no longer hanging in the study. But then one day, when I'm coming around the back of the house past the garage door, I looked in the trash barrel, and here's the president's picture. So I go inside and I collared my 3 kids, and I said, how comes the president's picture in the trash barrel with a lot of garbage and stuff? And one, they said he's no good. I said, that may be, but he's still president of the United States, and even though we deplore a lot of things that he has done, I don't think it's proper to throw, under certain circumstances, the president's picture in with the garbage. Now, maybe you think he belongs there. But we do have to show respect for the office, even when we can't show respect for the man. And that's one thing that's terribly lacking today. It's lacking in regards to your various police agencies. They're called pigs. They're called things worse than pigs, too. The worst kind of profanity is shouted at the officer who's trying to enforce the law. And that is not only a violation of the law of the state where I live, which forbids such thing. I have the law here. But it's a violation of the law of God. We're to show respect for authority. Now, I would like to give you some statistics. I know you get burdened to death maybe with statistics, but we're expected to prove our point. And I want to attempt to reveal just how nasty the present situation is. We have the facts and figures. Every 3 months I get a report from J. Edgar Hoover. I'll give it to you in brief, and then I'm going to give you a more voluminous report from the special agent in charge of the FBI office in Pittsburgh. The report dated January to March 1971, which I just received a week ago, reads as follows. I'm going to summarize it. Crime in the United States, as measured by the Crime Index, increased 6% during the first 3 months of 1971, compared with the same period in 1970. The violent crimes as a group were up 13%. Violent crimes. That's assault and battery, aggravated assault and battery, murder. The robbery increased 17%. Murder, 11%. Aggravated assault, 8%. Enforceable rate, 2%. And it's higher than that because a lot of these rape cases are not reported. The girl or the woman is ashamed to even report it to the police, and her family physician often doesn't. That's true also of venereal infection, which we have now reported cases to the extent of 2 million new cases a year. And many a family doctor covers up for the son or daughter of a family that he's been treating for many years, never reports it to the authorities. The property crimes as a group rose 5%. Burglary was up 70%. And I'm going to skip some of this here concerning cities of certain size and mention this, that cities in the 500,000 to the 1 million, which makes up about 2/3 of all robbery offenses, increased 17% during the first 3 months of 1971. Assaults with arms rose 3%. And now for a more graphic and it's quite depressing report, which I'm happy to say was given to me by the local special agent in charge of our local office of the FBI. We read, and I'm going to give you a quick digest of this, the gap between the criminal and justice is widening. Of course, we all know that. Crime is still increasing. Law enforcement is the butt of more abuse than ever before in our nation's history. Now, the deplorable thing is that the law enforcement officer is not only abused out on the street, he's abused when he gets into court. The jury's apt to abuse him. The defense counsel is certain to abuse him. And very often the judge will abuse him. I'll cite some cases, horrible cases of miscarriage of justice, where judges failed to live up to their responsibility by imposing a firm but just penalty upon the violator and instead punished the police officer. Abraham Lincoln is quoted, and you may be interested in this quote. We read here, this is in quotes, "Let every American, every lover of liberty, every well-wisher to his posterity, swear by the blood of the Revolution never to violate in the least particular the laws of the country, and never to tolerate their violation by others." As the patriots of '76 did to support the Declaration of Independence, so to the support of the Constitution and laws, let every American pledge his life, his property, and his sacred honor. Let every man remember that to violate the law is to trample on the blood of his father, and to tear the charter of his own and his children's liberty. Let reverence for the laws be breathed by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. Let it be taught in schools, in seminaries, and in colleges. And let it be written in primers, spelling books, and in almanacs. Let it be preached from the pulpit, proclaimed in legislative halls, and enforced in courts of justice. Now, in comparison to what he said, what is the situation today? The deplorable thing is that when police officers try to enforce the law, they have eggs thrown at them. Water guns are used that are not filled with water, but with ammonia, squirted in their face. They receive no end of tomato barrages and garbage, and even human excrements thrown on them in bags. They are sometimes dynamited, cherry bombs are thrown at them, and these saboteurs are very ingenious. They paste BBs and pieces of metal on the outside of a cherry bomb so that when it fragments, it can do a lot of damage. And red pepper and darts are used. The pepper is thrown in the eyes of the mounted men, and also the eyes of the horses, and the darts are thrown into the horse. They make a splendid target for darts, you know. And this is a situation that exists all over the country. I have here the instructions that these saboteurs are given. I'm not going to read them to you. I think you're pretty well acquainted. I think I ought to tell you something about the situation in our colleges. Our colleges today, the universities. I'm not talking about Christian colleges, such as was represented here and as represented yesterday by Dr. Bob, and we have some Christian colleges that are recognized outside in some of these exhibits. But during the academic year 69 to 70, There was a total of 1,785 demonstrations on the big college campuses. As far as I know, none on any of the schools that I represent. As a matter of fact, if any dirty hippies came on those campuses throwing bombs or excrement or anything else, they'd be thrown off so fast and so hard they'd be bouncing for a year. They're not tolerated. They must behave. They must abide by the rules and the regulations. Now, in these campus disturbances, there were 462 injuries, but 2/3 of these injuries were suffered by the police who were trying to quiet the disturbance. That wouldn't be the case if the police had been given proper authority to use the force that's necessary. Whenever it's been my privilege, and it's often my privilege, to lecture to members of various police departments, I have advocated something that, of course, the do-gooders think's terrible for a preacher to say. And I've told these men, if a rioter tries to hit you on the head with a brick, shoot him. A brick can be just as lethal as a .405 Winchester. Can kill you just as dead. And we're going to have to deal with force. But that isn't done. Now, there were 7,200 arrests made on college campuses during that year, 69 to 70. The bomb attacks, as you know, have been increasing. They're not only bombing the headquarters of ROTC on these campuses, but military installations and buildings. And they're throwing bombs into police departments and stores and banks. And you know, they even bombed the U.S. Capitol, didn't they? They're not going to stop any place. They'll be bombing our churches next. Don't be surprised. I'm going to shock you. That's one reason when I preach there's a gun under my coat. They're not coming in our church and throwing any bombs and getting away with it if I have time enough to get the gun out. We have often been threatened. Quite some months ago, one of the most notorious Negro criminals in our area, whose name is Bowie Hayden, paraded up and down in front of our church and making remarks that frightened people coming into the building. He has a 3.5-page FBI record, which I have. He's been guilty of every crime, perhaps with the exception of murder and counterfeiting. The only reason he hasn't been charged with murder is due to the fact that the people he assaulted managed to live. But he's out. He's a Democrat, too. And he gets the colored votes lined up behind the Democratic Party in Pittsburgh. Has a horrible record. Well, we won't stand for that. We don't want anybody threatened coming into our church. Now, I made it clear from the pulpit, Bowie can come in here and sit down and behave himself. He wants to listen to the Word of God and to the gospel. But if Bowie or anybody else comes in and creates a disturbance, either they go out through the door or I go out through the door. Somebody's going out. And the thing that dissuaded Bowie, I told some of my people, you go out and tell Bowie Hayden I'll meet him in the middle of the street with a gun any day. Bowie left. He understood that kind of language. However, it hasn't been too long ago that a Negro communist that I'd never seen before, didn't know, and another man accosted me at the door of the church and threatened my life. But he made no moves. If he hadn't, I told him frankly what happened to him. I said if he grabbed for a gun, he was dead. Said, we won't tolerate it. I'm fed up with this thing. Then he threatened to go up to my home. And I said, if you ever go up to my home, molest my wife or my family, you're going to get it for keeps. And I told the chief, I said, Chief, if that happens, don't send an ambulance, send a morgue wagon. And he understood that. He hasn't been back either. Now, I want to cite a few instances of crimes against the police. And then I'm going to try to tell you, Colonel Bunker told me to take as much time as I wanted, so we're going to give you a lot of these facts that I was going to cut down on. I'm going to tell you what you can do to help this situation. Your attendance here is fine, but it's not enough. Carrying placards isn't enough either. Even support your local police on the back of your car won't save the situation. It'll help, but it's not enough. For instance, in Nebraska, Omaha, Nebraska, on June the 16th, I think it was, 1970, the police department received a telephone call that a woman was screaming in a certain residence. And as you would expect, the police promptly responded. And when they couldn't get in, one policeman went around back, the other policeman stayed front. The policeman who was in the rear heard a shot, and when he ran around front to see what had happened, his associate had been shot with a high-powered rifle from a building across the street. It was an ambush that had been set up to kill this man. In Minneapolis, there was another case that I'll bring to your attention in the same year, in which the police department received a telephone call that a woman was in the process of having a baby. And you know what they do. They always tear a situation like that and try to get the expectant mother to the hospital. When they got there and opened the door, here's a suitcase right in front of the door. And one of the policemen, without thinking, lifted it. When he did, it blew up. And he was blown to bits, and several of his associates were very severely injured. In Toledo, Ohio, a policeman's sitting in his parked car at the curb, and a Negro walks up, sticks a gun against his head and says, "Here, baby, here's something for you," and blew his brains out. Now, I could read of no end of cases like this. Who commits these crimes? In a large percentage of instances, they are committed by repeaters. Think you know what I mean by a repeater? A man who has been arrested many times. I may mention a case this morning where the man was a 10-time violator, yet he was still out when he committed his 11th crime. We have men in the Pittsburgh area who are out on bail who had already committed 2 murders before they performed the 3rd murder. You know why they're out on bail? The Supreme Court has handed down a decree that no bail dare be too severe or exorbitant. And if the authorities were to hold a man, say, for $100,000, under $100,000 bail, the Supreme Court would be sure to turn him loose. They'd say that's exorbitant. That's too much. The man can't raise that much bail. So you'll have to turn him loose until he's tried. And with the awful backlog of cases in our courts, that man's have to be free for many months before he is tried, during which time he'll commit other crimes, which most of them do. And that's one of the weaknesses in our probation system. We're not against probation. If a man shows that he has been rehabilitated, if he's been, shall we say, spiritually converted, he should be given special consideration. But a lot of them don't show that. When you speak to the judges and say, "Why in the world are you permitting this fellow, that fellow, another fellow, this other chap to be released?" You know what they tell you? We need more room in our prisons. So we have to decide who's the least offender and let him go and put the more severe offender in his place. So hundreds of law violators are roaming our streets today to jeopardize your health, your safety, and your property. Now, a brief rundown on police murders. During the years of 1960 to 69, 561 police officers were murdered in America. 741 persons were arrested in connection with these murders. Now, we're going to analyze the men who committed the murders. 75% had a prior record of arrest. 54% had a previous record of conviction for a violent crime such as murder, but they're out on the street. 2/3 of this group had received leniency in the past in the form of probation or parole. And, incredibly, 1/4 of these murders were actually on parole or probation when they murdered a police officer. And 19 had been previously convicted of murder. Now, I think I've said enough along this line for you to recognize the breakdown in our courts. We can contribute a whole lot of this to the Supreme Court rulings, which have tied the hands of the police and the prosecuting authorities. I'm thinking of one mother, for instance, who called the police, confessed that she had beaten and murdered her 4-year-old child, and they arrested her and held her for trial, but the judge freed her. You know why? Even though she had voluntarily made this confession, I suppose she was under some extent of conviction, the police had not informed her, now you're entitled to a lawyer to be present to defend you and tell you what to say and what not to say. You don't even have to make this confession. And because she hadn't been told these things, the judge had to free her. She thanked the judge. He said, don't thank me. You thank the U.S. Supreme Court, which is really turning you loose, because it's the Supreme Court that has handed down this decision. Now, what can you do to help the situation? Is there anything practical? I think that there is. I've already told you your presence here is fine, but you know, when you get scattered out among 200 million people, it doesn't mean too much. And these placards are fine. I believe in them. They're okay. Support your local police, but just having that placard on the back of your car is not enough. It's not going to restore law and order. You're going to have to do far more than that. For quite a few years now, I have been trying to sell the various authorities with whom I came into contact that our police needed training. They not only needed training, but that we needed to build up large auxiliary police forces, deputy sheriffs and auxiliaries and, for instance, boroughs in small cities. We've been able to sell this idea to some departments and are actually doing that. I tried to do it in the borough where I live, which is Wilkinsburg, Pennsylvania. But the ADA Democrat lawyer, who was the mayor at that time, didn't want anything to do even with a police auxiliary, let alone an augmented force. They had 40 men on their auxiliary then. I tried to get them to realize this isn't near enough men to handle a disturbance or riot, which I knew was in the offing. He wanted to disband the auxiliary. I was telling him you'd need at least 100 men in addition to the men that are on your force. He wouldn't accept it. We made certain overtures to the sheriff of Allegheny County. We're fortunate to have a sheriff who has a record, an excellent record as a policeman, Eugene Cohn, and he's a Democrat. We wrote up this thing for him as we did for the president of the Game Commission of the state of Pennsylvania. Some time ago, he asked me if I wouldn't propose a curriculum for these state officers, of which I was one. I said, I'll be glad to. And we did. They have an excellent school. But up until their adoption of a school, they were sending men out, giving them a gun and a blackjack and whatever other tools they needed without any training. They were ignorant of the law. They were ignorant of the tricks of a lot of these shyster lawyers. They didn't know how to properly write up a case, and I want to tell you, you have to be an expert at this particular instance. I'm thinking of a case in Pittsburgh where they got authority from a magistrate to search a certain residence for drugs. They were absolutely certain that the people who lived there were pushers. They went to the magistrate and merely gave him the address, that's all. And then with this search warrant, they entered the home. They found the drugs. They didn't find them upstairs. They found them down in the basement. And because the search warrant didn't say they'd be found in the basement, the people were freed. That's the kind of a Supreme Court you have. You must specify where they are. How can the arresting officer know exactly where contraband is going to be hidden? He can't know that. You see how their hands are tied? Let me tell you another shocking case. I know this man real well. As a matter of fact, I defended him when our ADA mayor was going to fire him. I'll tell you the story. It'll make you laugh. This particular man, who is now a lieutenant of police, was a sergeant at the time. When he came out to the intersection of two of our main streets, Swissvale and Penn Avenue, he saw a car with 3 Negroes in that didn't have a license on it, so he told them pull into the curb. Instead of pulling into the curb, they tramped on it, went to a red light, just missed an ambulance coming down the hill. They drove down the main street of our town, 80 miles an hour, with him chasing them. When they got under a railroad viaduct, they foolishly tried to make a sharp left turn at an angle, and they wrapped their car around the light stanchion. One of the Negroes jumped out with a gun in his hand. This man, who was then sergeant, leaped out with a gun in his hand, told him to drop the gun, and surrendered, and he wouldn't do it. Started to run, so he shot him in the seat of the pants. And the man who was with him took a shot at another one of these fellows and missed him. There was one who was trying to hide in the wreck of the car, and they hauled him out. Now, the mayor was going to have that officer fired for shooting a Negro in the seat of the pants. And let me tell you just what led up to that episode. Those particular men, at the point of a gun, they had stolen that car they were in. They had held up a store. They had also held up a bus, robbed the driver of all the money that he had, and then, of course, violated every traffic ordinance I think we had in driving down the main street of the town. Yet the mayor was going to fire a conscientious policeman who did his duty. So when they had the hearing, I appeared and hammered on the door, and the mayor came to the door and said, "We're not going to let you in." I said, "You are going to let me in." He closed the door, so I hammered some more, and he opened the door. He said, "We're not going to let you in," and closed the door. The third time that I hammered, I said, "Listen, Mayor, you either let me in this hearing, or I'm going to give you the worst write-up you ever had. Now take your pick." He says, "We'll let you in." So I went in, and instead of having me sit down in the front, they put me up with the police commission. Then he started then to upbraid and malign the sergeant. Charged them with being trigger happy, and that was the first time he'd ever shot at anybody. And he just went on and on and on and on. Finally, I stopped it. I said, "Mayor, there's only one thing wrong with the sergeant's shooting." He said, "What's that?" And this broke up the hearing. I said, "He didn't shoot high enough." Now, that man has since been in prison for holding up a bank. That's where he is. And the mayor was going to have him turned loose. I don't mean the sergeant. I mean the fellow got shot in the seat of the pants. This same man was eventually promoted. He's now one of our lieutenants. And he thanks me. He said, "You saved my job, and you're largely responsible for the fact that I'm now one of the lieutenants." And he's a good one. Now, let me tell you what happened. Some time ago, he saw a car with 2 suspicious men in the front seat, and when he looked in the car, here's 125 suits piled up in the back of the car. He arrested them on suspicion. They couldn't account for these suits. He eventually discovered they had been stolen from one of our nearby stores. So the case went to court, and it was thrown out, and you know why it was thrown out? He hadn't, first of all, gotten a search warrant to search that car. And the men who had stolen these suits sold those suits back to the man from whom they stole them. They're out on the street today. A lot of things like that. Now, we can do something to stop it. And I'll tell you something that we have tried. It's working. Of course, if we get an unsympathetic sheriff in, he can disband what we're doing. We have a sheriff's auxiliary, which I have been helping to build up, of nearly 400 men. And it's a trained auxiliary. Quite a few of us have uniforms. They don't all have to buy a uniform. They're very expensive. We pay for all this out of our own pockets. We buy our guns, we buy our ammunition, our uniforms, we pay for our own transportation. We're that much interested in law and order. In addition to that, we have a magnificent mounted troop. Ride horses. They look fine in parades. As far as I'm concerned, when they're out on the practice field, they look better. These men get pistol instruction. I have been one of the instructors, pistol and revolver, riot guns, also heavy assault rifles, machine guns, every Monday night if they want it. If they miss 4 Monday nights and they're a member of the team, they're off the team. In addition to that, we are arranging now to have 2 patrol boats on the rivers of Pittsburgh and 12 pursuit and search planes. The Civil Air Patrol is coming over, joining us, so their planes will be used to help us in work. And in addition to that, there'll be 2 sound trucks. You know, police messages are sent out on various wavelengths. You can't all use the same equipment and receive the same message. So we'll have 1 truck that'll just receive, we'll have another truck that just sends. Now, in addition to that, there's a lot of training and instruction. And I want to give you some idea of just what we completed. We had a police school for these men, for anyone else who wanted to attend. The policemen from local agencies, an awful lot of policemen today are hired without any instruction whatever. My borough just hired an officer that didn't even know how to load his gun. He's almost as bad as our former local school superintendent who wouldn't stand up during the riots. So he and the principal went down to the local gun store and each bought a little .22 to carry under their coat in case they got abused on the premises. And they didn't know how to load the gun, so I met the superintendent of education in the post office, and I said, Dr. Potter, for goodness sakes, get somebody to show you how to load that thing before you shoot yourself in the foot. Now, one of our men did shoot himself in the foot, believe it or not, he did. And the range where I had been teaching, you wouldn't want to believe it if I were to tell you there were scores and scores of bullet holes, not down where the target is, but up in the ceiling. Now, here's what we did during the winter. Beginning November the 23rd and extending all the way down to in June. We had courses, for instance, in the introduction and foundation of criminal law, arrest and discretion. We went all the way back, Colonel, to English law, upon which our law is based, made a study of it, and made a study of all the primary laws of the country. Then we had the most outstanding authority on the motor vehicle code give us a series of lectures, and they were excellent. We had a man who's the chief investigator for the Pittsburgh Police Department teach us how to perform a criminal investigation. We had a special agent of the FBI there to explain the work of the FBI, its crime laboratory. They have a facility, as perhaps you know, that in seconds, when you send in your information by computer, you get a message back whether the man's a crook, whether the gun you've picked out has been stolen somewheres or used in another robbery or crime. That comes back in just a matter of seconds. We also had representatives of the district attorney's office to explain their work. The local crime lab gave lectures in fingerprinting and how to produce evidence. We had a course in basic psychology, community relations, how to testify in court, communications, firearms, and then defensive tactics. We were taught how to disarm a man with a loaded gun, and guns were used. They jabbed them in your stomach, and you were shown how to take that gun away from a man before he could actually pull the trigger. You have a quarter of a second upon which to operate. Your hands can work that much faster than he can pull the trigger. Now, it's not much of a break, but it's quite a break. If you are acquainted with fast draw tactics, you perhaps have heard that Doc McGivern, who was one of our greatest pistol shots, could fire, according to the record, 5 aim shots in 3/5 of a second. The fastest I ever was able to do it was to pull the gun out and empty all the cartridges in the silhouette of a man in a second and 3/4. Doc had had me dead before I got started, wouldn't they? But even that's a little fast. Now we did something else that will interest you, and if you'd like to know more about it, if you're interested in trying to attempt the same thing in your own community, here is a copy of the police manual. My secretary did this work. It's beautiful mimeography. We made copies of this available to all of our men. They have the information. They know how to do their work and do it properly. They're taught how to get around a lot of these Supreme Court restrictions and to do it legally without breaking the law. This particular volume, it represented an awful lot of work. We sold exactly at cost. It was $4 with a binding, $3 without a binding. Everything you need to know concerning police procedures in here. It's an excellent piece of work. There's one final thing that I'm going to say. I don't know whether the colonel wants me to shut up by this time or not, but I'd like to give you a reference or two concerning something that's involved in all this disregard for law and order that's threatening to destroy our country. There's a spiritual problem here, but we can't wait to convert all of these fellows before we deal with them. If they're in the process of a riot, you're going to have to deal with the situation dispatch. Your Supreme Court will take weeks, you know, haggling over some little technicality of the law, but they expect a policeman to arrive at a decision in split seconds. Well, you have to work fast. Let me give you an explanation that we have here in the book of Ephesians concerning the spiritual background. Why are people like this? Why are they committing all of these crimes? In Ephesians, we read in chapter 6, verse 12, "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places." When Christ came to earth, there was a lot of demoniacal activity. All through the Gospels, you read references to these very unsavory spirit beings. And in the days prior to the end of this dispensation, the Bible indicates there'll be other such activity. Now, what is it that happens to people that are under the influence of Satan instead of under the influence of God? In chapter 2 of Ephesians, we read in verse 2, "Wherein in time past ye walked, according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air." That's another designation for Satan, the spirit that now worketh in the children of disobedience. Often when you read this word worketh, it's the word in Greek energein. He energizes. You read the 2nd chapter of 2 Thessalonians, you're told he's the one who will energize the Antichrist, who leads perhaps a Russian horde up against Jerusalem in battle, only to be annihilated at the second coming of Christ. Now here's something else that happens, and this is a frightful thing. Sometimes people become so bad that the Lord says, let them alone. One occasion, the door of the ark was shut. Everybody outside of the door perished. On another occasion, Edom, let them alone. And Esau was such an instance. Sometimes God says not only the people of antiquity, but I think of people today, let them alone. He gives them up to do the things they want to do. The worst thing that God could do to you would be to permit you to have your own way, to be your destruction. Here's what we read now in Romans, and I'm going to close with this reference. You've been very patient. "Because that when they knew God," there was a time when this country knew God, "they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like the corruptible man, the birds and four-footed beasts, and creeping things." And then 3 times we're going to read this in this section. "Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness, to the lust of their own hearts." Maybe this describes a lot of horrible things that are going on today. I haven't seen this personally, but I read in publications that in New York City, you can go into the theater there and witness every possible sex act being committed on the stage, even women having intercourse with animals. We can't get much lower than that. Do you realize that? If you read the 20th chapter of Leviticus, that's one reason why the Lord ordered the extermination of the Canaanites. I wonder if the Lord has been giving up a lot of these people just to do the horrible things that they want to do. And it says to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Right before I left, I received a pamphlet. I opened the thing, and it's filled with photographs. It's filled with photographs of a quite attractive, beautiful young woman and a young man engaged in every kind of sexual intercourse that you could be possibly engaged in. They want to sell me the course. They want to give me that training. 70-year-old buck, 72-year-old buck like me, I'm not interested. Not at all interested. And I wouldn't have been interested either 40 years ago. Some of the pictures are, you just can't believe it. Every kind of intercourse you can think of. Natural, anus, oral, masturbation, just everything. The various things that would be performed by women, one with another, homosexuals, all in photographs. You could recognize the person. If I ever see these people in the streets of our city, I'm going to grab them for something. I want to tell you that. Yeah, we'll cook up some kind of a case to put them out of circulation. Now we read on, who changed the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And again we read, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use. And men likewise changed the natural use. And it goes on to say again, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. May God help America. May that not happen to us. I certainly want to thank you, and may the Lord bless you in this great endeavor. And we ought to praise God for people like Colonel Bunker and Mrs. McKinney and the wonderful members of her family and their associates in making a rally like this possible. Thank you.